Everything else from here on out for the lab is rather smooth sailing. So with our mouth, we have a few different things that we need to be able to identify. We're going to say this is the oral cavity. You need to be able to identify the hard and soft palate. So the hard palate is going to be like the bony or harder roof of your mouth. Soft palate is going to be an extension of that, but it's not going to have any more bone, so it's not going to feel nearly as rigid, so it's softer. And then an extension of the soft palate is the uvula for your gag reflex. Then we have different teeth. We have 4 different types of teeth you should be able to identify. The ones toward the back are molars. The ones in between them and the next set are premolars. Then we have 2 canine teeth, 1 on each side, on the bottom, 2 on top too. And then we have 4 incisors on each aspect of the jaw, upper and lower. Alright, so you don't need to know the different numbers of those, but you do need to know that we have 20 deciduous teeth, or baby teeth, and 32 permanent teeth, adult teeth. And you need to be able to distinguish between the 4 different types of teeth. Alright, so the front ones are incisors. These ones next to those front ones would be the canines. Think of your sharper teeth for shredding meat. Then we have our premolars, and then our molars. Salivary glands, these are pretty straightforward. We have a parotid gland. It's going to be anterior to your ear, so your ear would be like right here. Alright, so this is kind of like the side of your mouth almost. Then we have a submandibular gland. So think about this as mandibular, right? Jaw, so subjawbone. So your jawbone would be right here, right below the jawbone. Submandibular, salivary gland. And then we have our sublingual gland being right below where the tongue would be. Alright, so your tongue would be kind of connected right here. Sublingual gland, sub-tongue gland. Alright, so those are your 3 salivary glands you should be able to identify. Now, breaking down what a tooth looks like. So we have a few different regions we should be able to identify. We should be able to identify the very top part, which is going to be consistent of the crown region, made of enamel. We have this inside part, that's going to be the dentine. And we have this very inside part in the pulp. Alright, so this cavity that contains the pulp is the pulp cavity. Contains some blood vessels and nerves, keeping the tooth very much alive, supplying it with nutrients that it needs to stay healthy. And this tooth digs down into the gingiva, which is kind of your gums. And that region that it passes into the gingiva deep is called the root. Alright, so we have these different regions of the tooth that you need to be able to identify. There's extra stuff on here you don't need to be able to identify, but you can use that to gain perspective of where we're at in space with this tooth diagram. Now we can move on to the pharynx. Not too much here that you need to know. You just need to understand regionally what we're looking at. So just like when we looked in the respiratory zone, we have different regions of the pharynx. The oral pharynx, oropharynx, being behind the oral region, posterior to the oral cavity. And then our laryngopharynx being posterior to the larynx. Alright, so our laryngopharynx is going to be right behind the larynx, which then is going to have an epiglottis to help prevent food from entering our larynx. Alright, so those are the 3 things you should be able to identify here, the 2 aspects of the different pharynx and the epiglottis, which is part of the laryngopharynx. Then we have our esophagus. So this is now in objective 6 on page 60 of your lab manual if you're following along. We have our esophagus. You should be able to identify the cardiac sphincter, or on this diagram known as the lower esophageal sphincter. So you have your esophagus going all the way down and then passing through the diaphragm, and this lower esophageal sphincter is going to be entering into the stomach. Alright. And now we can get to our stomach, which has a little bit more identification wise than some of our other organs. We have 4 different regions. We have our cardiac region. This cardiac region is where the food first enters via the cardiac sphincter, all right, separating the esophagus from the stomach. Then we have the fundus. So this initial cardiac region has this spot where it can go up top a little bit more. It's kind of like the peak of the stomach, this fundus. Think about the peak of your fun in your stomach being the fundus. I don't know, however you want to memorize it. Fundus up top. Then we have the body, the main portion of the stomach. And then the pylorus, which is going to be leaving the stomach and entering the small intestine. And it does so via this pyloric sphincter. All right, it's a valve. So this is one of the valves that you need to be able to identify in this week's lab. So this is our first, or our second valve. We have the cardiac valve or cardiac sphincter. Then we have this pyloric valve or pyloric sphincter. All right, so a valve entering the stomach and a valve leaving the stomach. The stomach is made of these rugae in the mucosa, helping with digestion, helping mixing, contracting of that stomach, helping that mixing wave churning action. Then we have two different curvatures of the stomach. We have this long one, known as the greater curvature. We have this lesser one, known as the lesser curvature. Pretty straightforward when it comes to the stomach. You'll get it in a similar fashion as this. Just know that this shorter little angle will be the lesser curvature, and the larger one is the greater curvature. Now we can move on to the small intestine. Pretty straightforward. We have three sections: our duodenum, which is entering in from our stomach. This is the smallest section. This is also where we have pancreas and liver secretions. Then we enter our jejunum in the middle, and our ileum at the very end, which then connects to our large intestine, or our cecum of the large intestine, via the ileocecal valve. It's our next valve. So the pyloric valve separated the stomach from the small intestine, and now the ileocecal valve is separating the small intestine from the large intestine. And now we have our large intestine with a bunch of different regions we should be able to identify. So coming in from our small intestine, from our ileum through our ileocecal valve, we are in the cecum. Extending off of that, we have our appendix, thinking of immune functions going along with that appendix. Then coming up from our cecum, we're going to ascend, go up. So this will be our ascending colon. And then we're going to go sideways transversely via transverse colon. Then we're going to go down via our descending colon. And then we're going to sigmoid our way back with our sigmoid colon, kind of like an S here. And then we're going to leave via the rectum and anal canal. And there are sphincters in the anal canal allowing us voluntary control of defecation over time. Sorry about that. All right. So there are two different things that we need to be able to identify when it comes to regions of this large intestine that aren't necessarily specific structures. So these are flexures or regions. So we have a right flexure and a left flexure. You can think of them as aligning with a different organ. So the right one is where the liver would be in our body. So we're going to call it the hepatic flexure. And our left one would be kind of where the spleen would be. So we're going to call it the splenic flexure. And those are all the different aspects of the large intestine that you should be able to identify. And lastly, we could talk about some accessory organs. Our accessory organs, we go into a little bit more detail when it comes to lecture with. Here we just need to be able to identify that it is that organ. So you need to be able to identify this is the liver, this is the gallbladder, and this is the pancreas. All right. Then you also need to be able to identify the duct coming off of that organ, carrying the digestive enzymes that will be dumped into the duodenum of the small intestine. So with the liver, we have the hepatic duct. So just stem from the liver, this green line here. Before it meets with the gallbladder, it's got to be the hepatic duct. Hepatic meaning liver. So this is all coming from the liver. Well, all coming from the gallbladder is going to be the cystic duct. Those combine to be a common bile duct. So they're both dumping their bile contents into this common bile duct. And then that meets with the pancreatic duct to dump into the duodenum. So we have our pancreas with its own pancreatic duct. We have a gallbladder with its cystic duct. And we have a liver with its liver duct, hepatic duct. All right. That does it for this evening's lab. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Otherwise, we'll talk to you next time.